Hello, and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking. Every episode, we sit down to chat about the book read most recently by one of our book clubs. What did we make of it? Did it spark debate? And whether we loved it or loathed it, the big question is always, was it a great book club book?
Today we're talking about Educated, the best-selling memoir by Tara Westover, and the latest book read from my book club. From no formal education before the age of 17 to a PhD from Cambridge just over 10 years later, Westover's transformation is the stuff of Hollywood legends. And that's before you learn about the violence and brainwashing that tainted her upbringing within her Mormon survivalist family. Moving? Credible? Plenty to discuss? Keep listening to find out.
For our regular book club interview, we're dusting off our buckets and spades and getting into holiday mode to interview the Two Magpies book club, who meet in the convivial surroundings of a seaside bakery. All very nice in summer, but what's it like out of season?
It's stimulating, windy, grey, wonderful, and there aren't too many people on the pavements. It's really nice.
And we round all that off with some recommendations for your next book club read, inspired by Educated.
That's all coming up here on the Book Club Review. Hi Laura.
Hi Kate.
So here we are in the shed and we're enjoying a bit of a reprieve from the heat wave that's blasted the UK over the last few weeks. I've noticed whenever we start our podcasts, we always talk about the weather. And to me, that feels totally natural because I'm English and that's just like a reflex. But I think it's quite sweet that you, as a Canadian, have either just got so used to this that you now do it automatically too, or you've kind of politely adopted.
I'm not convinced that people all over the world don't talk about the weather all the time. I think the British are just a little self-centered and like, we always talk about the weather.
It's our thing.
It's your thing, yeah. Whether it's changeable or, as in the past, 8 weeks, where it's just been non-stop relentless heat.
It's been very exciting. It's reminded me, it cast my mind back to when we read The Trouble with Goats and Sheep, which was set in the epic heat wave of 1976.
Yeah, it reminded me of that too.
Yeah, The Creosote Jesus.
The Creosote Jesus. What a book.
Even though I wasn't that crazy about it, I do look back quite fondly on our discussion.
But today we are going to be talking about Educated by Tara Westover, which is the latest book read by my book club. You had read it about 4 or 5 months ago, I think.
Yeah, I actually lived in Idaho for a year as an exchange student when I had my year off between school and university. And I had just noticed that there was this book that had come out about this girl, sort of crazy story growing up with this, as you say, a survivalist family in northern Idaho. And I was just curious. So I read it and, well, I was completely gripped by it. Did you read it because I told you it was good?
I don't remember how we chose it. It just came up in
Let's say
the
that
discussion.
You read it because I told you it was such a great recommendation.
Absolutely. Well, it was a great recommendation. It's a memoir, and Tara Westover, I think, is maybe in her early 30s now. She might still be in her late 20s. As you say, she grew up in rural Idaho, and she was the 7th child?
That sounds about right. There were a lot of them, weren't there?
6 or 7.
Yeah.
And the youngest daughter. And she received no education before the age of about 17 when she taught herself enough to pass the standardized tests they take in America and gain acceptance to a Mormon university. Her parents were survivalists. They didn't believe in government, full stop, I would say. Her father believed that the end of days was going to come at any moment. And Tara Westover begins her memoir by talking about her vivid memories of being quite young, maybe 6 or 7, and the family stockpiling because her father firmly believed that they were going to be put under siege by the government. Once she is accepted to university, it becomes quite a different story because it's about her education, unsurprisingly, from the title. Not just formal education, but learning about a world she didn't know anything about. There's a scene when she asks what the Holocaust is in a classroom. She's surrounded by other first-year graduates, and everyone thinks she's making a joke.
She's been so isolated and shielded from knowledge of the world outside of this tiny area in Idaho where she lives. These mountains, Buck's Peak and the Princess, these mountains that she describes really evocatively. I thought there was some really beautiful nature writing in this book. She does that really well. But she has no knowledge of the wider world. She was just curious. She'd never seen that word before. So she put her hand up and asked what it was. And of course, everyone around her was completely horrified. They thought she was making a joke. And she then realised the extent of her own ignorance to some degree. But one of the really charming things about this book is that these realisations, they spur her on to find out. You know, she wants to learn. She wants to know.
Shall we read a little bit?
Yes.
This is from the opening of the book, and she is talking about her strongest memory while she's looking over the fields surrounding her family's compound in the mountains. On the highway below, the school bus rolls past without stopping. I am only 7, but I understand that it is this fact, more than any other, that makes my family different. We don't go to school. Dad worries that the government will force us to go, but it can't, because it doesn't know about us. 4 of my parents' 7 children don't have birth certificates. We have no medical records because we were born at home and have never seen a doctor or nurse. We have no school records because we've never set foot in a classroom. When I am 9, I will be issued a delayed certificate of birth, but at this moment, according to the state of Idaho and the federal government, I do not exist. Of course, I did exist. I had grown up preparing for the days of abomination, watching for the sun to darken, for the moon to drip as if with blood. I spent my summers bottling peaches and my winters rotating supplies. When the world of men failed, my family would continue on, unaffected. And then she goes on to say how she's been educated in the rhythms of the mountain, which is this backdrop. Later on, she, when her relationship with her family is very much breaking down and actually returning home risks extreme violence, she's still, I think, drawn back because that's where the mountain is more to her than any city could be.
Yeah.
She picks up on the fact that what separates her family from the rest of the community is their non-attendance at school. But what struck us in book club more than anything was just the cycle of violence in this home. And her father is very, very erratic in his moods. And later on, when Tara's at university and learns about bipolar, she thinks that's probably the condition that affects her father. He puts his children's lives at risk on a regular basis.
He's not physically abusive towards them, but he has this junkyard, which is his way of making money. And they take in old vehicles, bits and pieces, and they strip them down so they can sell the component parts for scrap. And all the children are expected to work in this junkyard. And they are routinely put in incredibly dangerous situations. And through the course of the book, they do all get injured in fairly horrible ways. And then the family don't believe in using government medical services. And the mother is a herbalist. She makes tinctures and
other homeopathic remedies.
Exactly. And these are used to treat these often really terrible injuries. It's kind of extraordinary, really, that Tara Westover actually survived.
That all the children survived. And actually, her father himself, someone in book club pointed out, he's equally reckless with his own life.
Yes.
And he ends up suffering third-degree burns after a gas tank in a car explodes. And his hands are turned almost into claws. And he doesn't go to the hospital. His wife treats him with salves. And he manages to survive. And then he becomes almost this figure for God's saving grace and also for the power of his wife's tinctures. And one of the oddities of this book, and you really couldn't make it up, is that by the time Tara's relationship with her parents is truly breaking down, just before they will stop talking to each other, her parents are millionaires. They've gone from extreme poverty, but have built up this homeopathy business.
Yeah, so at the beginning of the book, back in the sort of, what would it be, early 80s when she starts her story, they're just scratching out an existence. The dad's making a bit of money through the junkyards, and the dad sort of forces to become a midwife for the community of people who won't use government hospital services, and they prefer to have their babies on their own up in the mountain, but they need someone who can help. And reluctantly, Tara's mother becomes the midwife, and she gets paid sort of $500 a time, and so she starts to make money. But then, yes, just over the course of time of the book, gradually people start getting really interested in herbal remedies, and this sort of store of knowledge of sort of herbal lore that she's accumulated throughout her life means that she's actually able to start turning a thumping profit. And Tara goes back there, doesn't she? And instead of the sort of ramshackle old homestead, now they have all these sort of outbuildings where they've got all these workers who are preparing these tinctures for selling on. And
someone tells her off for using a loo in one part of the house, and they're like, no, that's not for employees, only senior management. And she's like, but
so that's quite odd. Going back to the family situation, seeing her interviewed and also in the book, she remains quite unjudgmental of her father. She really always seeks to understand him. She says that she thinks that he just didn't have that sort of part of his brain that would allow him to consider the safety of his children and take proper care of them. It just like he didn't see that.
Alice in my book club was saying she was so furious, not even just with the mother, who perhaps is so brainwashed that she can't see the peril her children are being put in, but the grandmother who lives just down the hill.
Yes, although I think she's shown to be powerless. She tries to do what she can, doesn't she? Because she tries to get Tara to come with her when Tara's only 7. She tries to get her to steal away with them to Arizona where they go for the winters. And she says, come with me, I'll put you in school. And Tara considers what she'd be leaving behind, and she considers her family, and she considers the scene where they search for her and they can't find her and how worried they'll be, and she doesn't go. So I think the grandmother does her best.
You say she's very non-judgmental with her family. I think she's also very non-judgmental with the Mormon community. I've heard an interview since finishing this book where she's asked if she's still a Mormon, and she says, well, I tried being a Mormon feminist, but it was just impossible. So no, I am no longer Mormon.
Famously, they have polygamy, don't they? And it would be hard to square it away, wouldn't it, with any kind of basic feminism?
There's a moment in the book which she manages to get humor in there, which is very dry and subtle, but almost the breaking point with Mormonism is that she just decides, no, when I go to heaven, that is the thought, when I go to heaven, I will not be one of many wives. That is too much for me.
In a way, it's not actually the violence of her day-to-day living arrangements. It's more the situation with the brother, Sean. That is the thing that eventually drives her out, wouldn't you say?
Yes, her relationship with Sean is really disturbing. Again, though, I think she does a very good job at showing why she continues to go back to that relationship and why she doesn't seek outside help until much later on. Before she hits puberty, it's quite a loving relationship.
That's the thing, yeah. And she shows that really well, that it's grounded in this incredibly close-knit family, because they were, weren't they?
And her brother he's a trucker, probably in his early 20s, when I think she's probably 12 or 13, and they spend 2 weeks driving around the country together, and it's like nothing she's ever experienced before. But then puberty hits, and he thinks that her purity is at stake. And he polices her in an incredibly aggressive way. And I think this family has always been quite, the violence is always present, so it's very normalized. Normalized as roughhousing. But he just starts calling her a whore all the time. If she doesn't do exactly what he says, he takes her by the hair and pushes her head into the toilet until she apologizes and agrees with him. And her parents are around, and that's what really, in the end, tears her apart from her family. Maybe we should not get into what happens there. You know that she's going to go to Cambridge from the flap, but I think the way that she shows the unraveling of the family is really interesting. So we'll leave that out, listeners, and you guys can find out exactly how it happens.
And so for your book club, was it a good discussion book?
My God, yeah. It was an incredible discussion book. We had a lot to say about it. As I say, Alice was just furious with the grandmother. Stu didn't understand why no one called social services. Frances had heard her speak and said what was so amazing about her is that she has no pretension. So when she is talking about something incredibly highbrow, she talks about it in the exact same way that she would talk about, I don't know, a show on Netflix. She doesn't differentiate, when you start talking about philosophy, you'll change your tone. And she didn't do this. And she's obviously so brilliant and such an original thinker, thanks in part to her very unconventional upbringing.
Well, this is the impression I was left with after I finished this. I almost felt, clearly you have to have the brains there to start with, which she obviously did. And it's interesting that she divides her family up. It's almost like the ordinary and the extraordinary, of those 7 kids. I can't remember, but certainly she and her brother Tyler both went on to get PhDs.
3 children go on to college and gain PhDs.
While the others remain uneducated and sort of doing simple
But you know
things.
what? I didn't think that she was calling the other 4 ordinary. I just thought she was talking about the odds. I think there's a sense that the other 4 children might have been just as clever. But how you are able to cope with this violence that dominates your life and also the extreme mental control that's inflicted on you.
Yes, the sort of gaslighting.
Yeah, total gaslighting. Apparently her parents justify their education by saying, well, 3 of our children have PhDs.
Yeah.
So
where it's really like, despite everything, 3 of our children have PhDs. But just to go back to the point, it's almost that sort of incredible isolation that she experienced growing up from any kind of intellectual sphere meant that she was incredibly open and incredibly curious, and it was almost like there were no limits to where she could take her mind, because she'd never experienced any kind of structure or framework that might suggest that there were limits. It was almost an inverse idea to, the actual realities of her situation. But intellectually, she was just ready to go as soon as she got a chance, got some books, started to understand that there was this framework out there. Then it's really extraordinary just following her description of how this just opened up before her. And it feels like all she's really doing, almost in her mind, is following her own curiosity and her own intuition and her own common sense.
Stu felt that the second half of the book was less original than the first one and a bit more self-conscious, and we talked about that quite a bit.
This is the Cambridge section, or more to do with the brother?
No, university onwards. So she attends a Mormon college, and the 4 years are just, the first few years are just kind of constant... not embarrassment, because I think after, the episode where she describes asking about the Holocaust, she's determined not to expose herself in quite the same way, even though it's sort of unavoidable. But she gets discovered by a professor who, in one of her courses, and he suggests that she come with him and a group of students to Cambridge. And I believe she receives a grant for this. There's a whole section on navigating funding for university, because she's been taught that you do not take money from the government, and yet she is eligible for grants that would keep her in school. But she travels to Cambridge and she writes an essay there. And I think the professor sits down with her and is utterly taken aback by what has just appeared in front of him from this young woman.
And again, it's the sense of people recognizing this mind, this clarity of thought. But I mean, at the same time, I can't remember what it is that her special area of interest is, but it's some kind of obscure philosophy as it relates to Mormonism and John Stuart Mill or something like that.
It's intellectual history.
Yeah,
so she's writing about thinkers.
Incredibly dry and incredibly niche. And to me, it was quite strange, that idea of this academic path and why that matters. I find that quite hard to relate to, but at the same time, I was very interested to read about it.
Yeah. I think Stu felt maybe in a weird way that she'd gone from one world to another world. And obviously high academia in itself is quite an insular community. But we talked about the fact that actually she isn't now a professor. Rather than carry on within academia, she wrote her memoir. And it sounds like she's going to keep on writing now that she's done this. I think she's going to be a fascinating woman to keep an eye on, because you can imagine she'll reinvent herself, whenever it strikes her. We should say there's a really moving section at the end where she suffers from a mental breakdown, and she is incredibly strong, but she's not undamaged.
Yes. Yeah, I think so. I think that comes across. And it makes her relatable. I mean, that's the other thing, it's all so bizarre, this whole story, and yet at the same time you can't help but identify with her and you really root for her. And that's just very enjoyable.
It was a fantastic book club book. I don't think we've had such a lively discussion in a long time.
Oh, great.
And I would highly recommend it for all book clubs, but also, just anyone. It's a fascinating read. It is inevitably going to be turned into a movie, it sounds like.
Oh, right.
In our introduction, we said it is the stuff of Hollywood.
Yeah. Yeah, and reading it, you can kind of see it, actually. It would make a good film. In fact, I emailed a friend of mine who works as someone who looks out for books for a film company to develop into movies. I was like, listen, I know this is obviously totally out there. It's on the New York Times bestseller list, so it wasn't exactly a secret, but I've just read this. It would make such a great film.
So, a great book, likely to be a great film, and Tara Westover is one to watch.
Many people have fond memories of family holidays in British seaside towns, and one in particular that retains a devoted following is Southwold, on the east coast of Suffolk. The town has had many literary residents over the years, from George Orwell to Emma Freud. Penelope Fitzgerald's 1978 novel The Bookshop is set in the fictional town of Market Harborough, but to all those in the know, it's Southwold. Today, the town does have a bookshop, an unbranded branch of Waterstones called the Southwold Bookshop. In addition to championing local authors and supporting festivals, the shop runs a thriving book club in partnership with the Two Magpies Bakery over the road. It so happened that the club was meeting when I was there on holiday, and so I joined bookshop manager Steph and the rest of the group to find out more. Steph, tell me about the book club.
We set it up 3 years ago, and the first book we talked about was Go Set a Watchman. We meet in the Two Magpies, which is the bakery across the road, and we meet every month.
Carol, describe to me those evenings in the Two Magpies.
Well, first of all, we have to get coffee, and then you can have something to eat if you'd like something to eat, and that helps the discussion flow. And then whoever has proposed the book, or maybe someone from the book club, talks about it a bit and says why they liked it, and then we have a general discussion. And that can be quite wide-ranging, or maybe we can all agree. But there's normally quite a lot of different views. We do cover a lot of different types of book. We do lots of current books, but also we've done things like The Old Man and the Sea, which was enjoyed by everyone, I think. Some foreign authors, political, as we have tonight, but it does vary. And these are things you wouldn't come into a bookshop and pick up yourself, so it adds a different dimension to your thinking on it.
Margaret, tell me, people come and go in Southwold, it's a seaside town. Is there something about the book club, does it ebb and flow, the membership?
We do have some visitors who sort of pop in if they hear about it, but then there's a sort of a hard core of some of us. Yeah.
And what is it you like about it? What keeps you coming back?
I joined because I wasn't reading very much and I thought it would make me read. And, I mean, you're walking in here, look at all the books. Steph's ever so helpful, but what do you buy? Now, this, whether you like them or you don't like them, the fact remains you've got a big variety of books you're going to read, and that's fantastic. And then you discuss it all with other people and realise the bits you didn't pick up, and either go home and reread it or just feel embarrassed and shut up. One of the two.
And tell me, Mary, are there any books that have particularly stood out for you?
I really enjoyed When I Lived in Modern Times, Linda Grant. That's why I recommended it for the group. I did love Eleanor Oliphant, and everybody loved that. There's been many, actually.
Janet, do you ever try to choose books that relate to the place in some way?
Bookshop was the one that specifically, because obviously that was her experience. She wrote that book based on Southwold, although she's changed the name in the book. It was in Southwold. I don't think it gave Southwold a very good press, actually. But,
This is Penelope Fitzgerald. So we're in the bookshop.
the bookshop is just over the road, so you're very near the original bookshop. Yeah. But the building's still there, yeah. And they've made it into a film now, and apparently we don't come across very well. I don't think it's very good. It doesn't look very welcoming. It doesn't seem very welcoming, which is the complete opposite to our experience in the book group. Yeah. Very welcoming book group. Lovely.
It does seem very welcoming. And if people were visiting and they saw that the book group was on, would they just be able to come along?
Yes, we've had people who are on holiday and have just turned up for the... I mean, I've got a second home here, so I'm here about 40% of the time. I'm rising. And I thought, well, it's a nice way to get into the community. So I've been coming for about 8 months now. Everybody's very welcoming. Yeah.
As well. Oh. So because I was sorting out my mum's house and her being elderly and going into a care home. And so I was up here on my own, very isolated, really. And so I just thought, yeah, okay. And it's been fantastic. I've met some lovely people.
Yes.
And I imagine Southwold in the summer, it's sunny, it's warm, there's the sea, it all feels sort of effortless. But how is it in the winter?
Lovely, empty. It's stimulating, windy, grey, wonderful. And there aren't too many people on the pavements. It's really nice.
And then I imagine having a cosy book club in a warm bakery must be a very nice thing.
Yeah, absolutely. But the relationships that we've made, I think, are really important. I'm just fascinated by the way that people see such different things to the way that I see them. And it's really nice to be able to wave to them and like them as people and thinking, oh, you think differently to me. That's fine.
Hilary from Kessingland. Have there been any books that have stood out for you particularly?
I read about 3 or 4 books a week, so I get through them and usually can't remember what I've read. But I just love reading. I'm a passionate reader and I will read anything. I just finished Home Fire and I thought that was just a fantastic book. Quite shocking. It'll be really interesting to hear everyone's opinions about that. I think that will, raise the energy quite a bit.
And Mari, have there been any books that you've all really hated?
I think the worst thing you can say about a book is if it's boring. If you just don't like it, but it's still a good book, or there's good descriptions in it, or there's something in it you like, that's okay. But boring is the end. And I mean, talking about book clubs, because I'm in another book club near Norwich, and I think the selection of books is more interesting and more, I was going to say challenging, I don't mean in terms of reading, but in subject matter than than the other book club I'm in. And it's very easy for book clubs to just degenerate into the sort of, not exactly Girl on a Train, but that sort of books that are hyped up all the time, but actually, again, probably come in the really rather boring category.
The books here are different category entirely, and the discussions are as well.
And I hope it stays like that. It doesn't end up getting sort of too cosy, yes. We don't want it to be cosy.
Not even in winter.
No.
So, just to be clear, in Southwold, there is this little bookshop, the Southwold Bookshop, and opposite there's this bakery called the Two Magpies, which in summer you can barely get into. It's so mobbed with people queuing up for their delicious food. And it's just a little place that opened a few years ago, but it very quickly has sort of become the heart of the town, or one of the main places in town. And they have this book club which they usually have in the bakery, but because it was August and they were just so crazy busy, exceptionally they actually had it in the bookshop. So we were sitting in the bookshop over the road. It was really lovely. It was a big treat to be in this bookshop kind of after hours. It made me realise that actually it's very good doing a book club with a bookshop, because you're right there in this space surrounded by all these wonderful books, and also then the staff are so knowledgeable. So when it came to their choosing the next book, I could kind of see they had this real wealth sort of inspiration. Often with my book club, we're all sort of slightly, oh gosh, because we're not very good at preparing, and it just depends whether anyone happens to have a suggestion that stayed with them or not, whether we, how we pick our next book. But whereas there, it felt really great. You could just sort of browse the shelf. That was really nice.
For sure.
And I felt like that helped keep it intellectually challenging in a way. They weren't going for the obvious things, although, I think some of the books they mentioned feel like sort of classic book club reads. But at the same time, they were doing things that were more unusual and quite challenging. That night that I went, they were discussing When I Lived in Modern Times by Linda Grant, which won the Orange Prize a couple of years ago, which interestingly was, I think a classic example of something that I would never have picked up. And indeed, I think a lot of the ladies there were saying it wasn't something that they would have thought to read. But actually, it made for a really good book club book, I think, judging by their discussion. It was very animated and they all had lots to say, and it sounded really interesting. I was thinking, I'm curious to read it now.
My favourite line in that interview was one of the attendees saying how nice it is and the relationships that you build, and how you can wave to people on the street and say, oh, you think differently to me, and that's fine. And for me, that's why I love book clubs so much, is like you want to have a bit of friction, and you want to be able to you want to remember that people can think differently to you, and that's fine. That gets lost in the current public discourse.
Yeah, it's okay, isn't it? It's a sort of safe space to have those debates, because that's actually what you want. There's a tacit understanding that that's what makes it fun.
Have you read Penelope Fitzgerald's The Bookshop?
I have, and I would recommend that to everyone. That's a wonderful book, actually. That's a really, really, really wonderful book.
But Southwold doesn't come out well in it?
No, because it's a book about a lady who wants to start a bookshop in a town that doesn't want a bookshop.
Oh, really? Very important question. If you didn't meet in the bakery, did you still get to eat some baked goods?
No, they didn't. Sadly, they didn't have any baked goods the night I was there.
Tragic.
I know.
You'll have to go again next time you're there.
I'm actually thinking, I was so inspired by them. I'm thinking, well, I could maybe drive down just for one night every month, just so I could join in.
Do it. Inspired by Educated, here are some more recommendations for your next book club read. I'm going to recommend a very different book called Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. It came out in the last couple of years. You've read this one.
Yes. No, I'm a bit scared about devastating apocalypses. I spend quite a lot of time worrying in my own time about this. Not to the degree that Tara Westover's dad does, but I read little bits of that book. Yeah.
Station 11 is the story of the world as we know it, but 20 years on after the outbreak of a virus that has killed 99% of the global population. And what remains are very scattered small groups of individuals who are very suspicious of one another and who have very little contact with one another, except for our cast of characters, a traveling band of Shakespearean actors and musicians. And they move from community to community in and around what would have been Ontario and the northern US. Borders have vanished. And it feels like a strange compliment to Educated, just in the sense that the worst has happened in a way that it never does, and hopefully never will. But for Tara Westover's father, where he's waiting for the end of days. And when they were making all their preparations, I kept thinking about Station 11, which is a good book. And I'm not saying you shouldn't read it, because I don't really read many apocalypses either. However, it is haunting. Like, there were a few days there where I was just like walking around London and imagining it.
Yeah, I don't want to
with
have
the
that
lights
feeling.
off and overgrown.
I don't ever want to think about
And well, it's all right. I mean, I don't have children, so all that I really thought was that if a virus hits the world, I would just like to die pretty much immediately. Like, had a good run, had a good life. I don't want to be left among the sole survivors, because society is broken down and violence is endemic. There's death cults in certain towns, and the survivors are really traumatized by what happened to them. Nonetheless, it's an easy read and with a lot to discuss, and I think it'd be a great book club book.
Well, I feel like you maybe need to sell a little bit more what's positive about it. In my little tiny reading of it, I got the sense that there's this really lovely thread about literature and art and the idea of the things that we value and the things that we save. Is that not the sort of underlying theme? You know, the apocalypse is the mechanics by which she then examines all of this. It's really about the things that we regard as important and how those things get passed on. Is it not?
Yeah, but clearly it's the trauma that stuck with me. If that is there, and obviously the traveling band of performers, they are trying to keep alive that tradition.
Yeah.
Keep alive Shakespeare as much as they possibly can. And there's another character who starts to create a museum where he will put relics of the time before to try and keep alive these memories.
Things
because
like
it's all being
iPhones
forgotten.
and,
Yeah, like iPhones.
Toasters.
I feel like you read a lot.
No, I don't. I'm a good skimmer.
So, yes, a lots to think about and a great book club book.
And in lieu of a recommendation from a bookseller, perhaps we should just talk about one more book which came up, didn't it, in the discussion, which was the J.D. Vance book.
Hillbilly Elegy.
Yeah, which we talked about on, I think, our first episode, didn't we? When we did The Sellout. Yeah, we did Paul Beattie's The Sellout, and we did Hillbilly Elegy, back in the days when we used to attempt to do 2 books in one show, which has certain parallels, doesn't it? Again, this idea of someone coming from sort of very poor background, transcending their circumstances.
It does, and interestingly, Tara Westover never gets into her own politics, but when we recall J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy for my very liberal book club members, it's slightly tainted by the fact that he is an arch conservative and doesn't really believe that the state has any role in helping people get on. A key difference that someone flagged was that J.D. Vance, he is surrounded by love, and although his mother suffers from addiction and the town he lives in is suffering from kind of, post-industrial collapse, he has grandparents who love him.
Yeah.
It's never in doubt that his mother does love him, even though she's an addict. Whereas Tara Westover, there isn't a lot of love, other than from her brother, from Tyler. And that was one of the touching moments in that book for me, was them listening to music together. But nonetheless, J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy was a great book club book too. So yeah, try that one out.
Yeah, well, or if you're interested to hear the discussion, then go back and fish out our first ever episode.
That's all for this episode. If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club Review Pod, that's Book Club RVW Pod, or you can email us at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast, and feel free to leave us a review and help other book club lovers find us.
Books mentioned on this episode were Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel and Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. The Southwell Book Club discussed When I Live in Modern Times by Linda Grant. And if you keep listening to our extra bit at the end, we discuss A Handful of Dust by Evelyn Waugh, Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence, Crudo by Olivia Laing, and The President is Missing by James Patterson and Bill Clinton.
On our next episode, we'll be discussing The Faraway Nearby by Rebecca Solnit. It's the latest read for Kate's book club.
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading. What else have you been reading?
I've been on a bit of a 1920s kick, which is inspired by my new favourite place, Judd Books in Bloomsbury, which is a humanities bookshop just about a 5-minute walk south of King's Cross. And it's close to a pub that serves Spanish tapas. And nothing is better than going to Judd Books, buying probably about 5 used books, and then going and having Spanish tapas at the Norfolk Arms around the corner.
Oh, that does sound very nice.
And as a result, I've been reading lots of classics because you can pick them up, some really lovely editions for like £4. So I read A Handful of Dust by Evelyn Waugh. Have you read that one?
No. Any good?
Yeah, it's quite good. It's I love Evelyn Waugh's style. It's very cold and a bit mean, but so sort of arch that it remains funny nonetheless.
Cold and mean like Muriel Spark?
Yeah, actually, I think quite similar. I think they have, different time periods, but there is something about that. They're very intelligent and quite calculating. And they were both Roman Catholic converts, oddly enough.
Yes, and wasn't there the thing, actually, where she was supported by Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene?
Oh, I did not know that.
When she converted to Catholicism, I think they were just a bit like, great. You've
Come
joined
into
the
the
club.
fold.
That's right.
A Handful of Dust is about a marriage between 2 aristocratic individuals, and it's in the years shortly after World War I, where emotions seem to have sort of dried up. I don't know. I think it was trying to make a commentary on the impact of war and what it has done to human relationships. But the marriage breaks down, and it ends up, very oddly, with one of the characters in the jungle of South America, which is not where I thought it was going to go.
I didn't see that coming either. From your
so,
description.
It's a fun one, A Handful of Dust. I also read Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence.
Oh, yeah.
Have you read that one?
No. Well, all I know about that is it very raunchy?
It's really not that raunchy.
When was it written? Sort of 1928 or something?
I don't know if it was that early. Ooh, maybe about then.
But, long way before
and
Jilly Cooper.
And it was banned, so it was very famous. I've read Lawrence before, and he is hilarious because he has totally outdated ideas about human sexuality, particularly women's sexuality. So there's a lot of women sort of melting and giving in to men, which sits very uncomfortably with me, but nonetheless, as kind of a snapshot into the thinking of the period, is intriguing. Lawrence paired with Waugh is quite an interesting dynamic because writing around the same time, but very different styles.
Yeah, that sounds good.
What about you?
I picked up Crudo by Olivia Laing. Do you know about that?
I do know about that, but I've never actually read any Olivia Laing. I know you've read her essays.
Well, she wrote a book called The Lonely City, which actually I have and got about halfway through. And it didn't really draw me in. In fact, it did the opposite. It sort of pushed me out. I heard someone else told me when she gets to the David Wonarich chapter, that's when it gets good. And so I always sort of meant to dive back in, but I flagged at Edward Hopper.
I feel like Olivia Laing is a bit of a literary darling, though, isn't she?
Well, so I had, in a way, quite low expectations of this, but there's been such a buzz about it, and it is just the most extraordinarily beautiful cover. It's a Wolfgang Tillmans image of a lobster with a fly just sort of landed on the flesh, and it's just beautiful. And I was curious. I'd heard a few of the interviews, so I picked it up, and I actually really enjoyed it. I loved it. It's told from the point of view of a woman who is on holiday, and it's a countdown to her wedding. And there's this sense that it's so it's first person, but the author is Olivia Laing, but she's inhabiting the persona of this other person who was a sort of writer and art world figure and activist called Kathy Acker. Now, I don't know.
Was a real person?
Yeah, so she was a real person, and I think someone quite well known, and I don't know anything about Kathy Acker. And so I suppose, in a way, I'm completely testament to the fact that you can read this book and enjoy it, and it really doesn't matter if you don't have any idea who Kathy Acker is, although then you might be slightly shamefaced when you have any kind of discussion about it and people are like, well, who is she? And you have to admit you've still got no idea because you still haven't got round to sitting down in front of a computer and looking her up. But this Kathy Acker figure seems to be someone who was just very sort of fearless and bold. And so there's this really interesting kind of juxtaposition between what you sense are Olivia Laing's thoughts and preoccupations and concerns, and then this idea of this persona that she's kind of inhabiting with this Kathy Acker figure and what Kathy would have thought and made of things, that I just thought was really brilliant and really, really intrigued me and held my attention. And also it's very much a book of the moment. I mean, the moment, I don't know how long the moment it's going to be. It feels like a book for right now, like this minute, it's about Trump and it's about Twitter, and there's something very ephemeral about it, which again I really enjoyed.
It sounds like the opposite of what I've been reading.
No,
I've been digging my head in the sand in the 1920s, whereas you're reading up to the moment fiction.
Absolutely. I mean, it's occasionally I quite like to just try and make an effort to read something that there is a bit of a buzz about, because I'm kind of curious to know what I think. But I think it would make a really good book club book. because of the way it's written, it's something she's trying to do something really interesting, and also because she's known as a non-fiction writer, and this is her sort of first foray into fiction. It's fictional, it's made up, but it felt to me like there was a lot of truth and a lot of real life in there, and knowing that she has that background as a non-fiction writer, I just enjoyed this more. It felt really solid and real and there. Did you know that Bill Clinton, in conjunction with James Patterson, the New York Times top best-selling thriller writer, has published a book?
Is it new?
It's called The President is Missing. It just came out, and I ordered it from the library. And it's quite big and thick. On the back it says, "The president disappears. The world is in shock. But the reason he's missing is much worse than anyone can imagine, with details only a president could know, and the kind of suspense only James Patterson can deliver." So, yeah, Bill Clinton has helped. And I'm intrigued.
I like those
how
end
could you not
papers.
be?
The end papers are a fluttering American flag and
So-
a big picture of Bill.
So let me just read you how it starts and see what you think.
How far are you in?
Oh no, I haven't started it yet. I just flipped through a little bit of it in the library. The House Select Committee will come to order. The sharks are circling, their nostrils twitching at the scent of blood. 13 of them, to be exact. 8 from the opposition party and 5 from mine. Sharks against whom I've been preparing defences with lawyers and advisers. I've learned the hard way that no matter how prepared you are, there are few defences that work against predators. At some point, there's nothing you can do but jump in and fight back. "Don't do it," my Chief of Staff, Carolyn Block, pleaded again last night, as she has so many times. "You can't go anywhere near that committee hearing, sir. You have everything to lose and nothing to gain. You can't answer their questions, sir. It will be the end of your presidency."
Wow. That's some good summertime reading.
I mean, the obvious thing to think about it is this is written from this I point of view. So here is a president who came very close, didn't he, to being impeached.
Yeah, I know. Immediately you read that and you think he's going to be talking about Monica Lewinsky.
He's certainly a guy who knows his way through a congressional hearing.
Yeah.
And I thought there's some chutzpah there, isn't there? And kind of, writing this book, and basically, I assume he's going to be casting himself as the hero.
I imagine so, yeah.
So there you go. That's my summer reading. I'll let you know next episode how it all turns out.